Capital city Simferopol's reservoir is today less than 7% full, and the city has been having to ration water supplies. Even after the Russians built a nearly $4 billion bridge across the Kerch Strait here to connect the peninsula over to the Russian mainland, shipping in water is difficult, and life for the more than 2 million people on the peninsula is getting harder after the annexation, not better. The Russian government is having to spend billions of dollars a year to financially prop up Crimea, and it's largely all because of this canal being shut down by the Ukrainians over on the other side. And Ukraine is obviously not in any kind of mood to open it back up again. As a result, the current crisis in Ukraine can also be seen through the lens of climate and water conflict, and it's one of the biggest reasons why Russia is doing what it's doing now. The current Prime Minister of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, has stated on multiple occasions that the primary goal going forward for the Ukrainian nation is the reclamation of the Crimean Peninsula from Russia. Currently, Ukraine has no realistic capability to challenge the overwhelmingly more powerful and capable Russian military. But in the future, were Ukraine to join NATO and a murky conflict breaks out between themselves and Russia over Crimea, or in the eastern rebel-occupied Donbass where it may be unclear who started it, it's hypothetical that Ukraine could trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which states that, quote, "If a NATO ally is the victim of an armed attack, each and every other member of the alliance will consider this act of violence as an armed attack against all members and will take the actions it deems necessary to assist the ally attacked." Therefore, in the future, the fear of those in power in the Kremlin is that Ukraine will bring in the rest of NATO to fight Russia in taking back Crimea, and that is a war that Moscow knows it will lose. Not only because of NATO's much more advanced military capabilities, but because of Russia's own internal demographic problems. Ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia's deaths have exceeded her births, while the nation's fertility rate has been among the lowest in the world. And so the country's population has been shrinking almost continuously ever since. But since the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, this shrinking population problem has only gotten even worse. And Russia is currently undergoing its largest peacetime decline in people ever in all of recorded history, even worse than during the 1990s, right after the Soviet collapse. Right now, Russia has around 25 million men within the country who are of military service age, but the government knows that as time continues on, that potential pool of manpower is only going to get smaller and smaller. Therefore, it could be reasoned behind the inner walls of the Kremlin that the longer Russia waits to act upon Ukraine, the more difficult it is going to become in the future, and so the earlier, the better. Now, by occupying Crimea and by maintaining conflicts in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, Russia has so far succeeded in keeping Ukraine out of NATO. And by building up troops along the border and hosting joint military exercises in Belarus, Moscow is further able to signal to Ukraine that they are in danger, which can panic investors in the Ukrainian government and damage the economy even further, and which forces Ukraine to spend even more money on their own military and defense, taking away vital cash that they could be using to further develop their own natural gas infrastructure. And of course, Russia has been fueling a war inside of Ukraine in the east now for years, ever since 2014, that has greatly depleted the Ukrainian government's time, manpower, and resources. After being taken over by pro-Russian separatists following Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea, both Donetsk and Luhansk declared their independence from Ukraine 8 years ago, and after being supported financially and militarily from Russia, have continuously been fighting a war against the Ukrainian government ever since that has already claimed the lives of more than 14,000 people. For years, most of the territory of each has been controlled by the Ukrainian government. But just a few days ago, Russia, for the first time, officially recognized both as fully independent countries separate from Ukraine and deployed their troops into each. Right now, as I made this video, it's still unclear what exactly Putin is ultimately planning for Ukraine. He may only be plotting a limited strike into the country in order to permanently sever both Donetsk and Luhansk from the country, as he did with Crimea 8 years previously, and effectively occupy each. He may also be plotting a further limited strike from Crimea in order to neutralize the block in the canal in order to free up Crimea's struggling water supply. He may be planning to go further, though, to ensure that this situation never happens again, and push Russian territory all the way to at least some of the Dnieper River to simultaneously stabilize Crimea's geographic position by freeing up the water supply, deny even more of Ukraine's coastline and access to natural gas reserves, and set up a stronger potential defensive line against any attack from the west along the Dnieper River's banks. Alternatively, he may also be planning a southern takeover of Ukraine, which would simultaneously bring Donetsk and Luhansk into Russia, link up Crimea with the Dnieper River and the canal, block off Ukraine from the rest of the Black Sea, and transform the country into a landlocked state, permanently removed from any remaining offshore gas deposits, and link up mainland Russian territory with both Crimea and loyal Transnistria in the west. Or he may really be planning an all-out assault to take over the entire country, so as to guarantee that Russia and the CSTO's defensive lines against NATO are pushed further back towards the more narrow opening of the North European plain between the Carpathian Mountains and the Baltic Sea across the border of Poland, and in so doing, guaranteeing that Ukraine will never be used against them and that Belarus will never become an indefensible salient. From there, Russian provocations into Moldova are almost a certainty next. Another former Soviet state who isn't a member of NATO and conveniently already has a pro-Russian breakaway state that Russia will eventually get around to recognizing as well. Transnistria. It's all a part of Putin's repeatedly stated goal of bringing back the old Soviet and Russian empire for the 21st century. Now that Putin has chosen to invade, it's not entirely clear what's happening as the facts on the ground are rapidly developing. But what is clear are Putin's demands. He has demanded that the West agree to 3 main terms. 1. That Ukraine never be allowed to join the NATO alliance. 2. That NATO and the United States withdraw all of their armed forces from Eastern Europe back to the pre-1997 boundaries of NATO, ending in Germany, effectively abandoning Poland, the Baltic states, and much of the rest of Eastern Europe. And that 3. NATO and America agree to freeze the NATO alliance as is and rule out any future expansion of new members. And that the alliance will not hold any military drills in Ukraine, Eastern Europe, or in the Caucasus without prior Russian consent. The West and NATO, of course, will never accept any of these terms, and Putin must know this. But through the lenses of geographic security, the economics of oil and gas, the changing climate, the shortage of water in Crimea, and Russia's own sensitive internal demographic crisis, it's clear to see what Russia's primary concerns are with Ukraine, and only time will tell how Russia and Vladimir Putin act upon those concerns. But by analyzing how Putin has acted before during times of crisis, we can likely figure out how he'll act again in the future. The recognition of both Donetsk and Luhansk as independent countries and the deployment of Russian troops into both, before launching the full-scale invasion across the entire country next, mirrors a striking, uncanny resemblance to exactly what Putin and the Russian government did against Georgia 14 years previously, back in 2008. Back then, the Russian army invaded the country of Georgia in what would ultimately become the first European war of the 21st century. 2 pro-Russian breakaway provinces inside of Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, were each recognized by Russia as fully separate and independent countries, and then, by using the pretext of Georgian occupation of both, Russia deployed troops into both and, from there, initiated a full-scale land, sea, and air invasion across the rest of Georgia. Across the 12 days of intense fighting that followed, the Russians occupied both Abkhazia and South Ossetia within Georgia, solidified their de facto independence, and effectively dismembered the country, displacing nearly 200,000 people and causing Georgia to sever all diplomatic relations with Russia. However, it was, in the end, a decisive victory for Russia and for Vladimir Putin, as it kept Georgia from joining NATO, and at a time when NATO and the West were more distracted by the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan, there was little international attention, let alone condemnation. It would only be less than 6 years later when Putin would deploy the exact same kinds of tactics that he used against Georgia, against Ukraine, in Crimea, and the Donbass. And now in 2022, it once again appears that history is repeating itself in Donetsk, Luhansk, and Ukraine.